Hello everyone, I'm Mr. Furlong, and today we're talking about evidence for evolution. We know that evolution is supported by scientific evidence from many disciplines. So there's geographical, geological, physical, biochemical, and mathematical data. We're going to take a look at some of these today in this video, starting with fossils. So fossils, of course, are geological evidence, and they are preserved remains, impressions, or traces of once living organisms from the past. Here's a famous example of Archaeopteryx. This is a reptile that had feathers. Now, could it fly? We don't know exactly for sure, but we do know that this characteristic of having feathers had evolved at some point. You may remember Tiktaalik. This is the oldest known species to have 4 limbs and may have evolved into all of the different types of vertebrate animals we know today. Although the fossil record is far from complete, it does give us a snapshot of what life was like in the past and how species may have evolved. So a good example of this is the evolution of the horse. We can see many different species that led to modern day horses. By looking at fossils, we can sort of piece together what that environment may have been like. And we know that species that were around millions of years ago, many of them are not here today. And species that are here today, we don't find in the fossil record. So that does show us that there has been some changes that would have taken place in the history of the Earth. Continuing on with fossils, how can we date fossils? One way we date fossils is by looking at the age of the rock in which that fossil layer was found. So here we see the Grand Canyon. At different layers of the Grand Canyon, the rock has been tested, and we get an approximate idea as to how old that layer of rock is. So if there's a fossil found in that layer of rock, well, that gives us an idea as how old that fossil was. We can also look at the rate of decay of isotopes. That could include things like carbon-14 dating. When looking at radioactive isotopes, we look at something called the half-life. This is the time it takes for half of all the radioactive isotopes to transmutate into another element. And so with something like carbon-14, we know that all living things have a certain amount of carbon-14 in them. So when we find a fossil and we look to see how much carbon-14 is present, that can give us an idea as to how many half-lives it's gone through and approximately how old the fossil is. The thing about carbon-14 is it's very good if we're looking at younger fossils. With older fossils, we would use some other type of radioactive isotope like maybe uranium. Fossils can also be dated by geographical data. So for instance, prior to the breakup of Pangaea, we find fossil evidence of similar species on multiple different continents that today aren't together. But when we piece together where the continents were and the areas in which we find these fossils, we can get an idea as to when did these fossils live during the time of Pangaea, 250 million years ago. Another piece of evidence for evolution is morphological homologies, morph referring to body. For instance, the limbs of vertebrates has the same pattern, a single bone to 2 bones to many bones to the phalanges. Now, why is that significant? Well, remember Tiktaalik. This may be the ancestral species of all vertebrate animals. That for whatever reason this animal was successful, and fish, amphibians, birds, reptiles, and mammals all have maintained this same pattern of single bone to 2 bones to many bones to phalanges. We can also look at vestigial organs. These are remnants of lost functions from ancestors. So for instance, in humans, we have ear muscles. We don't use our ears to move, but many other animals do. All you have to do is take a look at your dog or cat, and they're constantly moving their ears. Or the appendix in humans. We don't need the appendix. It doesn't have any particular function. When it gets infected, we remove it. It has no known function. It did in the past, however. We know that snakes have leg bones. Well, if snakes never had legs, why do they have leg bones? Or whales have hip bones. They don't have any hips. Why do they have the hip bones? These are just remnants of their evolution. In biochemical evidence, this is comparing DNA sequences, or we can compare amino acid sequences in proteins. This picture that you see here is showing some DNA, and it's looking at multiple different species. The more similarities there are between sections of DNA, the more similar that those species would be, the more differences in the nucleotide sequence, the more different they are. We can do the same thing with proteins as well. So for instance, we can look at the different amino acids, and once again, the more similarities there are in a protein, the more similar that those species may be, the more differences there are, the more different they would be. Another piece of evidence is looking at molecular and cellular processes that have been conserved over time. So for instance, in all living things, DNA and RNA are the genetic carriers. This is a molecule that had to have evolved very early on. The genetic code is identical in all species. So if you were coding for tryptophan, it's going to be the same 3 nucleotides in all species. Things like mitosis, glycolysis, how we use ATPs, it's the same in all living things. Is this a coincidence? Or maybe does it show that we have all evolved from some common ancestor? So these are just some pieces of evidence that helps show that evolution is something that really is occurring. And I'll see you in class.